appears at the end. And so Balak and Bilam take center stage for this entire Parsha. And so we have to unravel a bit of this riddle and try to come to grips with what this Parsha is doing here. Is it simply the next stage in Moshe's, I don't want to say downfall, but Moshe receding into the background and starting to lose his place in our history? We saw the nation rebelled against him with the Meraglim. They quarreled, and then his own family with Korach. And now it's almost as if he doesn't exist when this Parsha begins. So let's try to answer some of these questions. First of all, why are we naming a Parsha after Balak, who is the king of Moab? Moab is one of our eternal enemies, even though we're related. As we've said many times, most of the fights we have and most of the enmity, it's all in the family. We see this with Esav, who is, after all, Abraham's grandson and Sarah's grandson. You know, we see this with many of the tribes that we come into contact with. And of course, Moab, who is the son of Lot, who is Abraham's nephew. So we're all related. And that doesn't mean we get along. But we're naming a Parsha after Balak. Why? So the classic answer, of course, is that sometimes you are rewarded not for what you've done, but something perhaps that your ancestor did, your great-grandfather or great-grandmother, or something one of your descendants will do. And so the classic answer is that while Balak is an unsavory character, but he does give rise, as you know, to Ruth, who is not only the convert par excellence in Jewish history, as we've talked about before, in my opinion, much more to be emulated than Yitro, but also, of course, the ancestress of David HaMelech and Moshiach. So Balak does have a claim to fame that will come much later, and that may be one reason why he merits having a Parsha. I will suggest later on that perhaps this Parsha isn't named for him at all. And no, I am not inebriated, but I'll talk about that in a bit. But why is Bilam, who is really the central character here in the story, why is he given so much coverage and credence? After all, he is one of only 3 people that I can think of who are referred to in Jewish literature as the Rasha, the evil one. Who are the 3? Well, the first one is Esav, and the other one, of course, comes much later in history, and that is Titus. Titis HaRasha, he who destroys the Beit HaMikdash. I don't know of anybody else called a Rasha except for those 2 and Bilam HaRasha. And yet he's given a tremendous amount of credence here. And
about Haman,
he's certainly not one of our friends. Even after he fails at cursing Bnei Israel, the task for which he is hired by Balak, he will later devise this plot to seduce this plot, or to have Bnei Israel seduced by the women of Midian, so as to trap them in sin, which they do quite successfully, unfortunately, in this eschatological idolatry, this really horrible type of idolatry with sexual overtones that will result in a very horrible plague that will break out and kill many thousands of people. Indeed, that is why later on we'll see, as the story unfolds in a future Parsha, that when we go to war against Midian, we will find and we will execute Bilam. That will be his end. So all the way through, even after God changes these supposed curses into blessings, nevertheless, Bilam continues in his way. Indeed, at the very end of the Parsha, so the pasuk reads, it's almost innocuous, but let me just find it. Right at the very end, the pasuk says, "Vayakam Bilam vayelach vayashav lemkomo." Bilam got up, he went, he returned to his place. V'gam Balak halach ledarko. Nothing changes. This is an indictment of Chazal saying, after all they went through, you would think that there would be an effect upon them. But no, they never give up their evil ways, either one of them. Nevertheless, they are featured prominently, and the story's all about them, despite their evil intent. As a matter of fact, if you want to play with the names, you may have figured this out. If you take the last letters of Bilam and you take the last letters of Balak, who do you come up with? Think. None other than, again, you take the last letters of Bilam, the last letters of Balak, and who do you get?
Amalek.
Amalek. So the rabbis are telling us that this duo of Balak and Bilam, they're as evil as Amalek, and you don't really get worse than that. They engage in this classic anti-Semitism, very reminiscent of the Nazis. And Jews are portrayed, Bnei Israel, portrayed for them as non-human and parasitic. If you look carefully at what they say. So Moab, or Balak, but really the people of Moab, say, like an animal, like an ox, they will lick up Yerak HaSadeh, all the vegetation that grows. In other words, again, don't think of them as human. Think of them as an animal that's eating what we need to survive. And then they say about the Jewish people, Hinei am yatzah mimitzrayim, hinei chisat ein haaretz. They came out of Egypt and they covered the surface of the earth. Well, clearly that seems to be a reference, because what covered the surface of the earth in Egypt? The locusts. So this is their way of kind of subliminally telling the people that's who they are. They're like locusts. And then to kind of make this complete, echoing something Paro said, or paraphrasing, they say, V'hu yoshev mimuli. And they are sitting, or they are dwelling. Mimuli can be opposite me, but remember when Paro said, Am Yisrael ravatzu mimeni. This harkens back to what he said. In other words, when he said it, they are rich or powerful or mighty from me. They are living off me, mimuli. In other words, it's us against them. And so even in Egypt, of course, it was within the same nation. But here we're talking in the Middle East. In other words, they are the enemy wherever they are. And therefore, says Balak to Bilam, we've got to do something to get rid of them. Now, you may ask the question, if Bilam is this powerful sorcerer, and there is a dispute among Chazal, did he have real powers of sorcery? The Rambam, the empiricist, the scientist, says, no, it was all sleight of hand. But pretty much everybody else argues with the Rambam and says he did have indeed these dark powers of magic and sorcery, what I call Balak magic or black magic. And as we'll see in a moment, that was for a reason. But, you know, he uses this power of the occult, you know, this dark force. He uses it initially to try to curse the Jewish people. Well, if he's so powerful, if he has these powers, and indeed, if he connects to God, which he does, why doesn't he use that power to bless Moab and Balak instead of cursing Israel? Well, we know the answer to this question because we see it in front of our eyes every day, where, instead of using the resources, the wherewithal that our enemies around us have to build themselves up and to improve themselves, they devote almost everything to attacking Israel. When money is given to the Palestinians, to Hamas, even now, when they're planning to give money to them to quote unquote rebuild, they'll use a lion's share of that money after they siphon off what they want for themselves for weapons. They won't use it to build hospitals or roads or schools. So we've seen this syndrome before. As we've said, the Palestinians would rather not see an Israel exist than see their own state exist. And they've always been cursed with this. And that's been their attitude, and that's the way it is here. So Balak doesn't say to Bilam, bless us so that we prosper and that we're safe and that we're protected. No. Curse the other side. So why are we giving prominence to Bilam? So the rabbis, Chazal, have a number of different approaches. The most popular one that perhaps everybody knows, it was in order to show the non-Jewish world that you don't have to be Jewish to have potential, to be gifted, to have vision, to have prominence. In other words, we're blessed with great leaders, but it wouldn't be fair if the non-Jewish world also didn't have those kind of leaders, so that they can't say, well, if we had a Moses, if we had an Abraham, we would be great too. Thus the phrase, Lo kam b'Yisrael k'Moshe od. There will never arise in Israel anyone like Moshe. But they ask the question, what do you mean in Israel? Why don't you say Lo kam ba'olam, or Lo kam b'historia k'Moshe? There will never arise anyone in the universe like Moshe. So they answer, but that's not true. There was someone potentially like Moshe who could speak to God, who had great strengths and could have been the leader who led the non-Jewish world in morality, in greatness, like Moshe Rabbeinu did. That was Bilam. Bilam was given that potential so the world wouldn't say afterwards, we never had anyone as great as Moshe. No, you did. Unfortunately, he used his powers for the negative. So by giving Bilam the ability to communicate with God, almost like Moshe panim al panim, in a sense, at God's beck and call, it's specifically so that there is an opportunity, just like God gave the other nations an opportunity to accept the Torah, so too, there was an opportunity for Bilam to be that kind of a leader. But of course, he fails in that task. So that's one approach. Another approach is that there is a certain benefit or advantage sometimes to having an outsider, not a member of the Jewish nation, praising Israel or witnessing or bearing witness to the greatness of Israel. We saw this to some extent with Yitro, where Moshe says, you'll be our eyes. You'll be able, because Yitro was a famous person, you'll be able to communicate to the world the greatness of God in a way better than we could, because we're prejudiced. We're God's firstborn. We're God's chosen people. And so when we say it, people think, oh, well, of course, you have to say it, because you're God's chosen people. But when somebody else from the outside says it, it makes a big impression. So when, Bilam says, "Ma tovu ohalecha Yisrael mishkanotecha, ma mishkanotecha, ma tovu," and how great are the dwelling places of Israel, of Yaakov. This is an outsider who is telling the world these people have a tremendous morality. They're very modest. Ohalecha Yaakov, the tents of Yaakov, they can't see into each other's tent. They mind their privacy. So, when it comes from Bilam, it's like, well, if Bilam says it, I guess we should believe it. And all of these, various phrases that are in our, praising us, talking about us in very elevated terms. We say, Am Kilavi, we are a nation that rises up like a lion. We're strong. In my office, I have a wonderful picture of this. I found it person actually in the Nachalat Binyamin, who makes these beautiful pictures of parts of the Torah where, you can personalize it. And so on this phrase that he says, Hen am kilavi yekimenu v'cha'ari nasa. They will rise like a lion and be Lavi is like a young lion and be glorified like the king of the jungle, the lion. And we took this picture and because our son Ari his name is Ari, means lion. And he put in a beret from the army, and it's a beautiful phrase. And it comes from Bilam. And it says something very beautiful about the Jewish people that, when we are endangered, although we're a peaceful people, we rise up and defend ourselves like a lion. So, these are wonderful phrases. Some of them can be taken both ways. When he says, for example, Henam levadad yishkon, we dwell alone, uvagoyim lo yitchashav. And when it comes to the nations, in the common vernacular, we don't compute. That may almost be Bilam trying to say something negative that we take as a positive. We do dwell alone. We are singular. We are an exceptional people. And the way we are able to go through history, indeed, lo yitchashav, it doesn't compute. How can we possibly reclaim this land and regenerate our nation and our language and rise to greatness against such odds? And Bli Ayin Hara win 12 wars, if you count, depending on how you count them. This is indeed something that does not compute. So Bilam says these things, and maybe the hope was that people will appreciate it when someone from the outside says it. And finally, maybe Bilam is given this prominence in order for God to demonstrate this ability to turn a curse into a blessing, a klala into a bracha, that Bilam intends to curse, but he ends up blessing. And this is, in a sense, a reflection on God's relationship with us throughout history, that many of the things that we look at on the surface that seem to be negatives, even a curse, turns out to be a blessing. And that's how God works. And maybe that's why this whole Parsha is really about God's modus operandi of saying, trust in me, because even the things that look bad to you are not. And indeed, our very presence here in Israel, the fact that one of the things that people point to, that Israel always was a country essentially lacking natural resources other than the Dead Sea. What did we have here? We had human resources, but not natural resources. And the bracha there in that seeming negative is that nobody wanted to live here. Even the land would not bloom. And, we go back to Mark Twain, who the famous commentary of his, that he went through the land, the air, the Holy Land, and there was nobody living here. It was desolate. It was deserted. But of course, that was a blessing in disguise. So that when we came back here, the land was essentially uninhabited. And it wasn't claimed officially, legally by any nation. And those missing minerals, well, at least the oil, that's, if the oil had been discovered here 100, 200, 300 years ago, well, this place would have been snapped up by who knows how many countries. But it didn't happen until we came. The land started to bloom, and now we've discovered oil, natural gas, and the minerals will begin to appear now that we're back in our own land. So perhaps that's part of what's going on here as well, is this concept of turning a curse into a blessing. Finally, what I want to say, and I mentioned this before, using some rabbinic license, I want to say that perhaps this parsha is not named after Balak after all. And I want to suggest that perhaps the word Balak, Bet Lamed Kuf, are really initials, and they stand for three different people who all have a common denominator. Individuals who had tremendous potential and could have been great and perhaps should have been great, and yet they used their powers, their strengths, their gifts for negative reasons or for evil. Who are the three? The Bet is Bilam, the Lamed is Lavan, and the Kuf is Korach. They're all very similar. We talked about Bilam and his gifts, but Lavan too had tremendous talents. He was, I always say, he was like the first psychotherapist, that he was able to read people. He knew how to get inside people, but he used that talent. And by the way, that's why Rivka sent Yaakov to him. To be a leader, you have to have that talent to read people, to know what their needs are and how they feel. But Lavan used it, unfortunately, for his own self-gain and became a con man. Korach, too, was a great man, super wealthy, very connected, and he could have used that position of prominence, both being in the public eye as a Levi who had an important position and having all that tremendous wealth. He could have really done great things, but he too let his ego run away with him. And he used those talents, his wealth, his prominence, his powers of speech, in order to seek to try to wrest power away from Moshe and Aaron, and ultimately go against God and be swallowed up by the earth. So in a sense, the Torah sometimes is presenting us with different kinds of role models. Some are to be emulated, most of them, but others are there to kind of be a warning, to be, a moral lesson. Don't end up like this. Every person has tremendous capabilities, tremendous strengths, but use them only for good, because if not, you'll end up like Bilam, who is forced to bless Israel and then is executed, or like Lavan, who ends up being an unsavory character that Yaakov and family run away from, or Korach, who ultimately has the earth open up beneath him. So I think when we look at this parsha, we don't have to look at it as something directed against Moshe, but we can look at it as a moral lesson for us to learn on many levels and appreciate the leaders that we had and have when they are really dedicated to the people, like Moshe Rabbeinu. And even as he's getting near to the end of his life, maybe he comes back, especially in Devarim, to be the star of the story. And Bilam and Balak show the mirror image of how someone can go bad and accomplish the opposite of what Moshe did. So all in all, a very fascinating parsha that seems almost out of place, a story that, you know, just kind of coming from another planet, but has tremendous lessons for us. And I think gives us a lot of food for thought. So I won't be able to take any questions or comments today. We should only hear Besorot Tovot, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same place, with a very interesting topic of who deserves to lead the Jewish people. And I'll let you mull over that and wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shalom. Yeah.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom וברכה.